The moment I switched our water glasses and saw pure terror flash across my son's face is something I'll never forget. My name is Eleanor Winters, and at 73, I never imagined I'd catch my only child trying to poison me just weeks after secretly taking out a $2 million life insurance policy on my life. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's video will show you exactly how to protect yourself from those who might not have your best interests at heart. This photograph was taken just 3 years ago, me celebrating my 70th birthday at my lakeside home. My son Richard stands beside me, arm around my shoulder, both of us smiling. I thought we were a loving family with nothing to hide from each other. I was wrong. Was raised in a small farming community where my father worked as the local doctor. Always observe carefully before making your diagnosis, Ellie, he would say. The most important symptoms are often hiding in plain sight. His wisdom saved my life 50 years later. After my husband Thomas passed away 5 years ago, Richard began visiting more frequently. What seemed like the caring attention of a devoted son gradually revealed itself as something more calculated. His questions about my finances became increasingly detailed, his suggestions about estate planning more insistent. "Mom, have you updated your will recently?" he would ask with practiced casualness. "At your age, it's important to have everything in order." Each question seemed innocent enough alone, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. My first concrete suspicion came when I discovered Richard had been photographing my medication bottles during his visits. I noticed this accidentally while looking through pictures from our family fishing trip. Between shots of the lake were close-ups of my prescription labels. When questioned, he dismissed it as just keeping track in case of emergency. But his expression told a different story. Rather than confronting him directly, I decided to observe more carefully. My father had taught me that proper diagnosis requires patience and evidence. I began keeping detailed notes about Richard's visits and installed a small security camera in my living room, disguised within a decorative clock. The pattern quickly became impossible to dismiss. Richard searched through my home office when he thought I was napping. He photographed financial statements. He tested my memory, then expressed exaggerated concern over minor lapses. Most disturbingly, he began suggesting I might need his more direct assistance with financial decisions. "Mom, at your age, managing these assets is becoming too complex," he would suggest with manufactured concern. "Why don't I help simplify things? Put everything in joint accounts so I can handle the complicated matters for you." Through discreet inquiries with my attorney, I discovered Richard had made multiple appointments seeking information about my estate without my knowledge. He had specifically asked about power of attorney requirements and how to document cognitive decline. My attorney, who had worked with our family for decades, found these inquiries concerning enough to contact me directly. "Eleanor," Richard expressed, "concerns about your cognitive capacity that don't align with my observations of you," she explained during our confidential lunch. He seemed particularly interested in mechanisms to establish decision-making authority without formal competency hearings. This information transformed vague discomfort into concrete alarm. The evidence suggested he was systematically laying groundwork to gain control of my assets that would eventually become his through normal inheritance, but apparently not quickly enough for his purposes. I developed what I called my protection protocol. I worked with my attorney to create estate documents requiring multiple independent medical evaluations before any change in decision-making authority. I established financial structures that protected core assets from impulsive actions. And I began carefully documenting all interactions with Richard. I confided in 2 trusted individuals, my longtime physician, Dr. Sarah Lewis, and my closest friend, Margaret, who lived nearby and could check on me regularly. "Your observations are troubling but not conclusive," Dr. Lewis advised. Continue monitoring while we establish baseline health documentation that would contradict any false claims. The breakthrough came during Richard's monthly Sunday dinner visit. He arrived bringing expensive wine and a new estate planning book he thought would simplify things for me. As I prepared our meal, he insisted on making tea, bringing it to me with uncharacteristic attentiveness. "Mom, I've been thinking about your future care needs," he began as I noticed the tea had an unusual cloudiness. "I've found a wonderful assisted living community that would remove all these burdensome responsibilities from your shoulders." When I explained I had no interest in leaving my home of 40 years, his expression flashed with momentary annoyance before returning to practiced concern. "At your age, independence isn't always the wisest choice. Accidents happen when seniors live alone." I left the tea untouched, noting his repeated glances toward the still full cup. When dinner was served, he volunteered to bring water for both of us, another uncharacteristic act from a son who typically expected to be served during his visits. The water glass he placed before me had a faint cloudiness similar to the tea. More tellingly, he watched with unusual intensity as I raised the glass, repeatedly encouraging me to drink. "You seem dehydrated, Mom. Drink up. It's important at your age to stay properly hydrated." I excused myself to the kitchen and quickly captured a sample of the water in an empty prescription bottle I had prepared based on growing suspicions. Upon returning, I deliberately created a distraction by dropping my napkin, and during the moment Richard bent to retrieve it, I switched our water glasses. The transformation in his behavior was immediate. When I raised what had been his water glass, he suddenly reached out, almost knocking it from my hand. "Wait, don't drink that. I just remembered I put some of my heart medication in that water. Senior moment of my own, I guess?" He laughed nervously. "Let me get you fresh water." The obvious lie, Richard had no heart condition requiring medication, confirmed my suspicions. My son had placed something in my beverages deliberately, with clear intent. "Actually, I'm not very thirsty," I replied calmly, maintaining outward composure while my internal alarm systems escalated. "Tell me more about your recent life insurance policy." The question visibly startled him. "What life insurance policy?" "The one with National Security Life," I continued, watching his expression carefully. "For $2 million, on my life, taken out 3 months ago, with you as sole beneficiary." The color drained from his face as he realized I had discovered information he had carefully concealed. His expression cycled through shock, denial, and calculation before settling on defensive indignation. "That's just responsible financial planning, Mom. Every advisor recommends appropriate insurance coverage for estate purposes." "Interesting," I noted calmly, "especially since I already have appropriate coverage arranged through my own planning." "Coverage you're well aware of, as we discussed it after your father passed. This second policy seems redundant, unless its purpose is different." If you've ever had that moment when you realized someone close to you wasn't who you thought they were, hit that subscribe button and notification bell, because in part 2, you'll discover exactly what was in that water glass, the shocking conversation that followed, and the unexpected ally who helped me uncover the full extent of my own son's devastating betrayal. Richard stared at me across the dining table, his practiced composure cracking around the edges as he realized I knew about the life insurance policy he'd hidden from me. The cloudy water glass sat between us, physical evidence of intentions, too terrible for a mother to contemplate. If you haven't seen part 1 of this story, I recommend watching it first to understand how I discovered my son had taken out a secret life insurance policy on me and may have been attempting to poison me during what should have been an ordinary family dinner. "Mom, you're completely misunderstanding the situation," Richard insisted, his voice strained with forced casualness. "The policy is just standard estate planning, and that water mix-up was just confusion about my supplements. I'd spent 73 years developing the patience to see through deception, and now I was grateful for every lesson life had taught me." "Then you won't mind if I have this water tested?" I replied calmly, holding up the small prescription bottle containing the sample I'd collected. The flash of panic in his eyes confirmed everything. "That's ridiculous," he stammered. "You can't possibly think I would." "I don't want to think it," I interrupted, surprising myself with my steady voice despite my breaking heart. "But I've learned to trust evidence over wishes, Richard." My late husband, Thomas, had always handled confrontations in our family, stepping in to resolve conflicts while I maintained peace. His absence in this moment felt particularly acute, facing our only son across a table where evidence of betrayal sat in plain sight, with no buffer between us. But perhaps this was fitting. I needed to handle this situation with clear-eyed determination rather than the emotional compromises Thomas might have made to preserve family harmony. "I've noticed the pattern for months," I continued. "The unusual interest in my finances, the photographs of my medication, the exaggerated concerns about my cognitive state that you've mentioned to my attorney, my doctor, and several friends. Now a secret life insurance policy and suspicious substances in my beverages. These aren't coincidences." Richard's expression transformed, abandoning pretense as he recognized denial was futile. "You don't understand the financial pressure I'm under," he said, his voice hardening. "The business is failing. Charlotte is threatening divorce if I can't maintain her lifestyle. The kids' college funds are empty." The cold calculation in his tone chilled me more than any angry outburst could have. This wasn't impulsive desperation, but methodical planning. My son had been systematically preparing to solve his financial problems through my death. "And your solution was to cash in on my life?" I asked quietly. "Rather than simply asking for help? Would you have liquidated your precious investments? Sold this oversized house you refused to leave?" He countered with unexpected bitterness. "You've always chosen your independence over our needs. You and Dad both. So proud of your self-sufficiency while I struggled." This distorted version of our family history revealed how completely Richard had reconstructed reality to justify his actions. The modest support we had provided throughout his adult life, helping with down payments, covering his children's braces and summer camps when his business had cash flow issues, loaning money for business expansions that were never repaid, had apparently been reframed as inadequate in his mind. "I have helped you, Richard," repeatedly. "What I haven't done is sacrifice my security to enable financial decisions that consistently prioritized appearance over substance." The words were difficult but necessary. "That's very different from planning my death for insurance proceeds." His expression hardened further. "You have no proof of anything except prudent financial planning. That water story is your imagination. Who would believe an elderly woman making dramatic accusations against her devoted son who visits faithfully every week? Especially a woman whose memory has been increasingly unreliable." The threat was implicit but clear. If I pursued this, he would escalate claims about my cognitive decline, claims he had already been establishing with people in my life. It was a calculated gamble that I would back down rather than risk having my independence questioned through manipulated concerns about my mental capacity. What Richard didn't know was that I had anticipated this exact scenario. "Actually, I have considerably more evidence than you realize," I replied, reaching for my phone and opening an app that displayed the security camera feed from the decorative clock, including video of you adding something to my water in the kitchen 20 minutes ago. The color drained from his face as I turned the screen toward him, showing clear footage of his actions. "You've been recording me? In your home? That's illegal," he sputtered, grasping for some advantage. "Not in a single-party consent state, and certainly not in my own home where I have reasonable security concerns," I corrected him. "But that's hardly your biggest legal concern right now." I hadn't called the police immediately upon discovering Richard's actions, a mother's hesitation that perhaps revealed lingering blindness where my son was concerned. But I had activated the second phase of my protection protocol the moment I'd confirmed my suspicions about the water. Right on cue, the doorbell rang. Richard's head snapped toward the sound, alarm replacing his previous confidence. "That would be Margaret," I explained calmly. "My dear friend who happens to be a retired toxicologist from the state crime lab. She's here to collect the water sample professionally, maintaining proper chain of custody for potential evidence." This wasn't the impulsive reaction of a confused elderly woman, but the carefully coordinated response I had prepared after weeks of mounting evidence. Margaret had agreed to remain on standby during Richard's visit, ready to implement our evidence collection plan if my suspicions proved warranted. As Margaret entered with her professional kit and formal documentation, Richard's confident facade crumbled entirely. The systematic preparations he discovered facing him reflected planning more thorough than his own, not the panicked reaction of a vulnerable victim, but the methodical response of someone who had anticipated his moves well in advance. "We can handle this privately," he offered urgently, as Margaret efficiently collected the water sample, labeled it, and sealed it in an evidence bag. "There's no need to involve outsiders in a family misunderstanding. Think about how this would affect your grandchildren if it became public." The emotional manipulation might have worked in the past, when protecting family harmony had been my primary concern, but the stakes had transformed that priority entirely. "I've already considered that impact," I replied as Margaret completed her documentation. "That's why Dr. Lewis will be conducting a complete toxicology screen on me tomorrow morning, and why my attorney has prepared a full statement detailing the pattern of concerning behaviors I've documented over the past 6 months. Each revelation further dismantled Richard's perceived control of the situation. What he had envisioned as a vulnerable, isolated victim had turned out to be the center of a careful support network of professionals who had been systematically monitoring his actions. "You've been investigating me? Your own son?" The genuine shock in his voice revealed how completely he had underestimated me. In his mind, I had remained the mother who overlooked his flaws and made excuses for his failures. Not someone capable of clear-eyed assessment of threatening behavior, even from family. "I've been protecting myself while hoping I was wrong," I corrected him. "There's a significant difference." Margaret finished her evidence collection and stood beside me, her presence providing both practical and emotional support. "The sample will be analyzed by tomorrow," she confirmed. "Eleanor, do you want me to stay tonight?" The question addressed the immediate safety concern we had discussed previously, whether I would remain in my home alone after confronting Richard. We had developed multiple contingency plans depending on how the confrontation unfolded. "That won't be necessary," I replied, making a decision based on Richard's defeated demeanor rather than fear. Richard was just leaving, and he won't be returning without prior arrangement and additional people present. My son stared at me with an expression I couldn't fully interpret, some mixture of shock, anger, and perhaps a trace of reluctant respect. The power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. His carefully constructed plan to exploit perceived vulnerability had collapsed upon discovering I was anything but the passive victim he had anticipated. "This isn't over," he said quietly as he gathered his things. "You're making a terrible mistake." "The mistake was believing you would place my well-being above your financial concerns," I replied. "Everything else is simply consequence." After Richard departed, Margaret helped me secure the house before conducting a thorough check of my medication bottles and food supplies for potential tampering. The necessary precautions felt surreal, implementing security measures against my own child in the home where I had once nursed him through childhood illnesses and celebrated his achievements. "Are you certain you don't want me to stay?" Margaret asked again as we completed our security check. "This has been an enormous shock, Eleanor. No one should be alone after such a discovery." Her concern was warranted but unnecessary. "I've actually been preparing for this possibility for weeks," I explained. The shock came gradually, with each piece of evidence I couldn't explain away. Tonight was confirmation, not revelation. After Margaret left with the samples, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by photographs spanning decades of family history. Richard's graduation, his wedding, the births of my grandchildren. The contrast between those captured moments of apparent family unity and the reality I now faced created a dissonance almost physically painful to contemplate. If you've ever had to face a betrayal so fundamental, it forces you to question everything you thought you knew about someone you love. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell, because in Part 3, you'll discover the shocking results of the water analysis, the unexpected alliance that formed to protect me when Richard escalated his efforts in ways I never anticipated, and how decades-old wisdom from my father ultimately provided the key to resolving a situation I never imagined facing in my 70s. The laboratory results arrived exactly 48 hours after Margaret had collected the water sample from my dining room table. As I sat in Dr. Lewis's office reviewing the findings, the clinical language on the report couldn't mask the horrifying reality. The water contained a carefully measured dose of odorless, tasteless antifreeze, ethylene glycol, mixed with a sedative commonly prescribed for sleep disorders. The combination is particularly concerning, Dr. Lewis explained, her professional demeanor tempered by genuine distress. The sedative would have made you sleepy and uncoordinated, while the ethylene glycol poisoning would have appeared as confused behavior followed by what could easily be mistaken for a stroke or heart attack in someone your age. The methodical precision was chilling, a poisoning strategy specifically designed to mimic natural causes in an elderly person, minimizing questions or investigation. Not a crime of passion or momentary desperation, but calculated planning by someone who knew my medical history intimately. Would it have been fatal? I asked, needing clarity despite the pain of the question. At this concentration, almost certainly, she confirmed. Especially given your age and the kidney issues noted in your medical history. The symptoms would have developed over 24 hours, by which time organ damage would likely have been irreversible without immediate specialized treatment. Treatment that would have been unlikely if everyone believed I was simply experiencing expected health deterioration in my 70s. Exactly the narrative Richard had been carefully establishing with people in my life. We need to contact law. Enforcement immediately, Dr. Lewis continued. This is unambiguous evidence of attempted murder, Eleanor. There's no other way to characterize it. Despite the clear logic of her recommendation, I found myself hesitating. Pursuing criminal charges meant accepting that my only child had deliberately attempted to end my life for financial gain, a reality so fundamentally devastating that some part of me still sought alternatives despite overwhelming evidence. Is there any possibility of error in the analysis? I asked, searching for uncertainty where none existed. Dr. Lewis understood the emotional resistance behind my question. Margaret had the sample analyzed by 2 separate laboratories to ensure absolute verification, she explained gently. Both produced identical findings. There's no ambiguity about what was in that water or its likely effects. As we discussed next steps, my phone signaled an incoming call from my attorney, Catherine Bennett. The timing seemed odd until she explained the reason for her urgency. Eleanor, Richard has just filed an emergency petition for guardianship with the probate court, she informed me, professional calm masking clear concern. He's claiming rapid cognitive deterioration, requiring immediate intervention to protect your assets and well-being. He's scheduled an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning. The calculated timing couldn't be coincidental. Richard must have anticipated the timeline for the water analysis and moved to establish legal control before evidence of his actions could be formally presented. His strategy revealed both desperation and continued underestimation of my preparedness. He's provided affidavits from neighbors claiming you've shown increasingly erratic behavior, Catherine continued, and documentation from a neurologist. I've never heard of a testing to concerning cognitive assessments supposedly conducted during wellness visits. I've never seen any neurologist except through referrals from Dr. Lewis, I clarified immediately. I suspected as much, Catherine confirmed. The petition is clearly fraudulent, but it's crafted to create immediate concerns that some judges might act upon pending full evaluation. We need to respond immediately and comprehensively. Dr. Lewis, who had been listening to my side of the conversation, gestured for permission to speak with Catherine directly. After I activated the speakerphone, she provided crucial context. "I'm with Eleanor now reviewing toxicology results from a water sample collected from her home," she explained succinctly. "The findings confirm deliberate poisoning attempt with ethylene glycol and prescription sedatives. We were just discussing contacting law enforcement when you called." The line went silent momentarily as Catherine processed this significant escalation. "This changes everything," she finally responded. "The guardianship petition isn't just fraudulent. It appears to be an attempt to gain control before his actions could be exposed. We need to coordinate an immediate, multifaceted response." The next several hours passed in carefully orchestrated activity. Dr. Lewis accompanied me to the police station, where Detective Morales from the Elder Crimes Unit took detailed statements and formally logged the toxicology evidence. Catherine simultaneously prepared emergency counterfilings for the court hearing, including comprehensive medical documentation of my cognitive health and sworn statements regarding Richard's concerning behavior patterns. By evening, events had accelerated, beyond anything I could have anticipated. Richard had been brought in for questioning based on the toxicology evidence and video documentation. My home had been processed as a potential crime scene, with additional substances found in my kitchen matching the compounds identified in the water sample. Most disturbingly, investigators discovered detailed notes on Richard's phone outlining symptoms of antifreeze poisoning and how they might present differently in elderly victims. The evidence was overwhelming, but the emotional reality remained impossible to fully process. How had my only child, the baby I had nursed through illnesses, the boy whose science fair projects I had helped complete, the man whose business ventures I had financially supported despite reservations, transformed into someone capable of such calculated harm? As I sat in Catherine's office reviewing documentation for the next day's hearing, this question haunted me more than concerns about legal proceedings or potential outcomes. Understanding the progression that led to such profound moral failure seemed essential, not just for legal purposes, but for my own capacity to integrate this reality into my understanding of our family history. "The financial investigation is revealing significant context," Catherine noted, reviewing preliminary findings from the forensic accountant she had engaged. "Richard's business has been functionally insolvent for at least 2 years. He's taken multiple high-interest loans using falsified collateral documentation. There are substantial gambling debts through offshore accounts, and the family home has 3 mortgages, all currently in default status." The scale of financial desperation explained the motivation, but not the willingness to cross such a fundamental moral boundary. Many people face financial crisis without contemplating murder as a solution, particularly of a parent who likely would have offered legitimate help if approached honestly. "There's something else you should know," Catherine added with obvious reluctance. "The insurance investigation has identified 2 previous policies Richard obtained on your life through different carriers. Both were purchased and then allowed to lapse when premium payments stopped. The pattern suggests this wasn't a first attempt at this approach, just the first one that progressed to active implementation." This revelation suggested a progression more calculated than momentary desperation. Multiple preliminary efforts before the final implementation attempt. The methodical nature contradicted any narrative of temporary moral failure under extreme circumstances, revealing instead systematic planning over extended periods. As evening deepened into night, I returned to Margaret's home, where I had agreed to stay until security measures could be implemented at my house. The spare bedroom felt simultaneously foreign and comforting, unfamiliar surroundings providing safety precisely when my actual home had been transformed into a crime scene by my own son's actions. "You should try to rest," Margaret encouraged, bringing tea that I couldn't help examining carefully before drinking despite knowing it was safe. Tomorrow's hearing will be emotionally demanding, and you'll need your strength. The concern in her eyes reflected understanding that transcended the immediate circumstances. As a toxicologist who had worked with law enforcement for decades, she had encountered family betrayals before, though perhaps none so personal as a son methodically planning a mother's death. How do you reconcile knowing someone you loved was capable of this? I asked, voicing the question that continued circling through my thoughts. Not the legal aspects or practical precautions, but the fundamental reshaping of your entire understanding of someone central to your life? Margaret considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, rather than offering reflexive reassurance. In my professional experience, this level of betrayal isn't something most people fully reconcile, she acknowledged. Instead, they learn to hold contradictory truths simultaneously: the person they genuinely loved and the person who proved capable of profound harm. Both realities remain valid, which is what makes it so painful. Her honesty was more comforting than platitudes would have been. The permission to embrace complexity rather than forced resolution provided space for authentic processing rather than artificially imposed closure. My father once told me that the most difficult diagnoses aren't those with clear symptoms, but those where the patient's presentation contradicts what testing reveals. I recalled, finding unexpected relevance in his medical wisdom. He said the challenge isn't choosing which evidence to believe, but learning to integrate seemingly incompatible findings into a more complex understanding than initially assumed. That insight seemed particularly applicable now. Learning to integrate the son I had loved with the person capable of calculating my death for financial gain. Not choosing between these contradictory understandings, but expanding my perspective to contain both simultaneously, however painful that expansion might be. The morning brought new developments that further complicated this integration. As we prepared to leave for the courthouse, Detective Morales called with updated information from the ongoing investigation. Mrs. Winters, we've identified communications between your son and his wife Charlotte that significantly impact our understanding of the situation, he explained carefully. Text messages dating back approximately 8 months show Charlotte repeatedly pushing Richard to solve the inheritance issue immediately and researching strategies to, in her words, accelerate access to Eleanor's assets before she gives everything to charity or blows it all on cruises. This new information introduced another dimension to the already complex situation: the possibility that Richard had been influenced or pressured rather than acting solely from internal motivation. While this didn't diminish his responsibility, it added context that slightly shifted my understanding of his actions. There's more, Detective Morales continued. We've found evidence that Charlotte has a history of similar behavior. Before marrying Richard, she was investigated in connection with an elderly neighbor's suspicious death after being added to his will. The case was never prosecuted due to insufficient evidence, but the pattern is concerning. The detective's tone conveyed professional restraint, masking genuine alarm. The possibility that Charlotte had identified my son as a pathway to financial gain through similar means previously attempted with others. This didn't excuse Richard's actions, but suggested manipulative influence that might have exploited existing weaknesses rather than representing entirely self-generated moral failure. As we arrived at the courthouse for the guardianship hearing, I found myself processing this new information while preparing to face my son across the courtroom. The competing narratives, Richard as calculated predator versus Richard as manipulated participant, created emotional complexity that defied simple resolution. The courtroom fell silent as Richard was led in, the handcuffs on his wrists creating a jarring contrast with the expensive suit he still wore from the previous day's arrest. His confident posture had collapsed, replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone facing consequences he had never truly believed would materialize. This hearing was meant to address Richard's emergency guardianship petition, but the circumstances had transformed dramatically overnight. Judge Carla Mendez, a veteran of the probate court system with 25 years of experience, had been briefed on the criminal investigation and toxicology findings, adding layers of complexity beyond typical guardianship proceedings. Before we address the petition itself, Judge Mendez began, her tone reflecting the unusual gravity of the situation, I need to acknowledge the related criminal investigation concerning attempted poisoning, which directly impacts claims made in these filings. Ms. Bennett, as counsel for Eleanor Winters, would you like to address the court regarding the petition's validity given these developments? Catherine rose with the measured confidence of someone who had anticipated exactly this direction. Your Honor, we move for immediate dismissal of the guardianship petition on multiple grounds. First, the timing clearly indicates this filing was a preemptive attempt to gain control before criminal actions could be exposed. Second, we have comprehensive medical documentation from Dr. Sarah Lewis confirming Mrs. Winters' complete cognitive competence. And third, the petitioner has demonstrated through his own actions that his motives are not the protection of Mrs. Winters, but rather obtaining control of her assets through fraudulent claims about her capacity. Richard's attorney, Douglas Parker, appeared visibly uncomfortable as he rose to respond. The senior partner at his prestigious firm had clearly not been fully briefed on the circumstances when taking the case just 24 hours earlier. His discomfort suggested he was now caught representing a client whose actions were far more problematic than initially presented. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the serious allegations in the criminal investigation, they remain unproven at this stage. The guardianship petition stands on its own merits based on documented concerns about Mrs. Winters' decision-making capacity and potential vulnerability. Judge Mendez's expression reflected skepticism that cut through the attorney's procedural argument. Mr. Parker, the petition contains affidavits from a Dr. Wilson attesting to cognitive assessments of Mrs. Winters. The prosecution has already provided evidence that no such doctor ever treated Mrs. Winters and that these documents appear to be fraudulent. Are you prepared to defend the submission of falsified medical documentation to this court? The direct question left no room for procedural maneuvering. Parker glanced briefly at Richard, whose expression had hardened into something between defiance and resignation, before responding carefully. Your Honor, I was not personally involved in gathering these supporting documents and cannot speak to their provenance. Given this new information, we request a brief recess to consult with our client. The requested consultation never materialized. Instead, as the judge announced a 15-minute recess, Richard suddenly stood despite his attorney's attempt to restrain him. This is ridiculous, he announced, his voice carrying across the courtroom. My mother has been making increasingly erratic financial decisions for years. The recent paranoid behavior, installing hidden cameras, making wild accusations, only confirms what family members have observed for months. This attempted poisoning narrative is a complete fabrication to avoid proper oversight of her diminishing capacity. The outburst revealed a desperation I recognized from childhood tantrums when Richard's carefully constructed stories began unraveling under scrutiny. The familiar pattern of doubling down rather than acknowledging reality was both painful and strangely comforting. Evidence that the son I had raised remained recognizable within the person now facing criminal charges. Before his attorney could intervene, Richard continued, now addressing me directly. Mom, you've always chosen your precious independence over family needs. Even now, you'd rather believe I tried to harm you than admit you need help managing your affairs. This whole poisoning story is exactly the kind of paranoid fantasy that proves my concerns are valid, Judge Mendez interrupted firmly. Mr. Winters, these statements are inappropriate and potentially self-incriminating. I strongly advise you to consult with your counsel before continuing. The warning came too late. Richard's emotional reaction had already undermined his legal position more effectively than any opposing argument could have. His desperate attempt to maintain the narrative of my cognitive decline directly contradicted the composed, clearly competent woman sitting across the courtroom, a contrast obvious to everyone present. Detective Morales, who had been observing from the back of the courtroom, approached the bench and requested permission to address the court. After Judge Mendez granted his request, he provided a succinct update on the criminal investigation. Your Honor, overnight forensic analysis of electronic devices seized from the Winters residence has revealed extensive research on untraceable poisons, methods to mimic natural death in elderly individuals, and detailed notes on Mrs. Winters' medication schedule and potential interactions. Additionally, we've recovered deleted communications between Richard Winters and his wife Charlotte, discussing various scenarios for accelerating inheritance and references to previous unsuccessful attempts involving medication tampering. This public confirmation of premeditated planning eliminated any remaining possibility that Richard's actions represented momentary desperation rather than calculated intent. The systematic research and multiple attempts described by Detective Morales revealed a campaign of predatory behavior spanning months rather than an isolated lapse in judgment. Richard's expression transformed as he realized the extent of evidence against him. The defiance drained away, replaced by something closer to the calculation I had glimpsed when switching our water glasses. The recognition that previous strategies had failed, requiring rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. I'd like to speak to my mother alone, he requested suddenly, his tone shifting to carefully modulated contrition. There are explanations she deserves to hear directly, without legal filters. The transparent attempt to access me privately, potentially, to manipulate or intimidate, was immediately blocked by both Catherine and Judge Mendez. All communication will occur through proper channels with counsel present, Judge Mendez ruled firmly. Now, regarding the guardianship petition itself, I am dismissing it with prejudice based on clear evidence of fraudulent filings and improper purpose. Furthermore, I am issuing a protective order prohibiting Richard Winters from any contact with Eleanor Winters outside of court-supervised proceedings. The decisive ruling effectively ended the immediate legal threat to my independence, though the criminal process was just beginning. As the hearing concluded and Richard was escorted back into custody, his gaze locked with mine momentarily across the courtroom. The expression contained contradictions impossible to fully interpret, anger and fear certainly, but perhaps also something resembling recognition of opportunity irretrievably lost. As we left the courthouse, I found myself unexpectedly overwhelmed. The adrenaline that had sustained me through careful preparation and legal proceedings began to fade, leaving space for the emotional reality I had been methodically compartmentalizing. Catherine noticed immediately, guiding me to a private waiting area where I could process without public observation. It's normal to experience delayed reaction, she assured me gently. You've been operating in strategic response mode for weeks. The protective focus on practical actions creates temporary emotional distance that allows functionality during crisis. Her understanding provided permission for the complex grief finally emerging, not just for the betrayal itself, but for the permanent transformation of my relationship with my only child, and, by extension, my grandchildren. The criminal proceedings would continue, with substantial evidence suggesting conviction was likely, but the family relationships had already been irrevocably altered regardless of legal outcomes. What happens with the grandchildren? I asked, voicing the concern that had remained secondary during immediate safety considerations, but now emerged as a central worry. They're innocent in all this, but their lives will be fundamentally disrupted. Catherine had anticipated this question, having already researched options while respecting my need to focus on immediate proceedings. There are several possibilities, depending on Charlotte's level of involvement and your preferences regarding ongoing contact. We can discuss supervised visitation arrangements through family court, potentially bypassing both parents if Charlotte's complicity is established. The prospect of maintaining connection with my grandchildren offered small comfort within the broader devastation. These children, ages 10 and 7, had done nothing to deserve the chaos adult decisions would create in their lives. Preserving Some stability and relationship continuity for them became my immediate priority beyond the criminal proceedings themselves. Detective Morales approached as we prepared to leave, his professional demeanor tempered by genuine concern. "Mrs. Winters, we've completed the processing of your home. It's been cleared for your return, though I understand if you might prefer alternative arrangements for the immediate future. The practical consideration, whether I could emotionally return to a home now transformed by awareness of what had occurred within it, hadn't fully registered until this moment. The dining room where Richard had attempted to poison me, the kitchen where he had prepared the contaminated water, the living room where we had reviewed family photographs together while he calculated my death. Could these spaces ever feel safe again? We've arranged temporary accommodations while you consider longer-term preferences," Margaret offered, having anticipated this challenge. "You can take whatever time you need to determine whether remaining in your home feels appropriate, after circumstances change so dramatically." Her understanding acknowledged that physical safety and emotional security were separate considerations. The house could be objectively secure while remaining subjectively contaminated by awareness of what had occurred there. This recognition of emotional reality alongside practical considerations provided space for authentic healing, rather than pressured decisions. As we left the courthouse through a side entrance to avoid media attention, I found myself reflecting on my father's wisdom about diagnosis requiring complete information integration rather than selective evidence interpretation. The painful truth I now faced required similarly comprehensive integration, acknowledging both the son I had loved and the person capable of calculated harm, without allowing either reality to negate the other. The coming weeks would bring further criminal proceedings, potential testimony, continued investigation into Charlotte's involvement, and careful consideration of my grandchildren's well-being. Each stage would require balancing justice with the complicated reality of family relationships fundamentally altered but not erased by betrayal. 6 weeks after the courthouse hearing, I sat in the visitors area of the county detention center, separated from Richard by a plexiglass barrier that felt like a physical manifestation of what had happened to our relationship. This was our first face-to-face conversation since the day I had switched our water glasses, revealing his intentions and forever altering our family's trajectory. Richard looked diminished in his institutional uniform, the confident executive, persona shed like an outgrown skin. His eyes held a wariness I'd never seen before, the cautious assessment of someone who had lost the ability to predict outcomes or control circumstances. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he began, his voice quieter. Then I remembered. "I wasn't sure either," I acknowledged honestly. "But there are questions only you can answer." The criminal case had progressed rapidly since the initial hearing. The toxicology evidence was unambiguous, the digital forensics damning, and the financial motive clearly established. Richard's attorney had already begun plea negotiations, recognizing the overwhelming evidence made trial a risky proposition with potentially harsher consequences. What remained unclear, and what had ultimately brought me to this difficult meeting, were the human elements beneath the legal proceedings. Understanding the progression from the son who had once brought me hand-picked wildflowers to the man who had researched untraceable poisons felt necessary not just for legal closure, but for my own capacity to integrate this reality. "Charlotte has been cooperating with the prosecution," I said, watching his reaction carefully. "She's provided extensive documentation about the financial planning and previous attempts." His expression hardened momentarily before resignation settled across his features. "Of course she has. Self-preservation was always her specialty." The bitterness in his tone suggested complexities in their relationship I hadn't fully recognized. The investigation had already revealed Charlotte's previous involvement